Okay, so will I just start off, Roland?
Please.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for this opportunity to talk. I was extremely lucky that I planned and was able to make a visit to Suriname and Guyana in late January, early February last year, before COVID hit, and also because of some of the troubles it hit because of elections in both of these countries. So very, very fortunate. And the visit was along with my friend and colleague, Michael Hopcroft. It's some of his photographs that I'm using as well as my own, and he'll appear in a number of the images. I'm trying to move my, no idea what's happening here. I don't seem to be able to move the presentation on. Oh.
So that's an issue for you.
There we are. Yes. Yep. Okay. So I'm talking about Suriname and Guyana, and I thought it would be helpful to begin by showing a map of where they are on the north coast of South America. And there are three countries which at various times have been called Guyana, or the Guyanas. From right to left, French Guyana, or also one point called Cayenne. Cayenne is now the capital. Now part of France, a département of France. Then Suriname, which was Dutch Guyana, although it began as an English colony, and England swapped it for a Dutch possession on the east coast of North America, which at that time was called New Amsterdam, and you'll know it now as New York. And then Guyana itself, present-day Guyana, which was British Guyana, and before that was three separate Dutch colonies. So there's a very strong Dutch influence in this area. I'm going to give you 6 reasons why Suriname is important for the history of Scotland, and particularly the history of the Highlands, and try and reflect how we can see that in some of the architecture and the little bit of the archaeology that I know about, including the industrial archaeology. And the first point is it's in Suriname that we see some very early involvement by Highland Scots in the ownership of slave plantations. And I'm indebted here to work that David Worthington from University of the Highlands and Islands has done in investigating this. Right. That's a map of Suriname from 1667. Now, a lot of the maps of Suriname and Guyana are produced up what we would regard as upside down with south at the top. So that's Suriname. What they call, interestingly, call the Indian Ocean at the bottom is the Atlantic. And then Suriname has a network of rivers extending from the coast into the rainforest. And I think that map just gives you that sense of the extent to which it is a country of rivers and forests. But up at the top of that map, there is a bit on the boundaries of where settlement by Europeans has taken place. There's somewhere called Armadale Hill, and just below that, which is north, there are 2 names, McAlphin and McPherson. Scottish names, actually Highland names, and maybe actually rendered in as a transliteration from Gaelic. That's a later redrawing of that map, and you can see the McPherson a bit clearer there. On some versions of this map from 1667, that is, instead of the individuals' names, there's simply a little bit that says Scotsman. So this little colony of Scots on one of the remoter parts of a remote colony, Suriname, from the 1660s. And they're Highland Scots, and what David Worthington has shown is the way in which this seems to be connected with the importing of sugar through Inverness into the Highlands from Rotterdam. So again, through the Dutch connections. There is another plantation at the same time, which is Highland ownership, Plantation Fairfield, on the right, I'm showing that on a later map. And on some maps, I cannot find, I've read descriptions of it, I can't find this map. It's not called Fairfield, and instead the name is given in Sranan, which is one of the languages of Suriname. And the name in Suriname is, in Sranan, is Macintossu, because it belonged to Macintoshes. Macintoshes of Borlum in Inverness. So in two parts of the colony from very early on, we've got Highland plantation owners. These plantations, and this is my second point, these plantations and Suriname as a whole is extraordinarily well documented thanks to the work of somebody called Philip Dickland. I haven't met him, I've corresponded with him. He's an architect in Paramaribo, the capital of Suriname. And Paramaribo is a World Heritage Site for its architecture, and this is Philip Dickland with the guidebook that he's produced of Paramaribo. Philip is one of the very small remnant now of the Jewish community in Suriname. These are people who were originally Sephardic Jews from Spain, who were then in the Netherlands and then ended up in Suriname from the same time as these Scots settlers in the 1660s. And on the Suriname River, there is Jodensavan, Jews' Savannah, plantations which were Jewish owned. And the plantations, the Macintoshes and the McPhersons and the McAlpins, their plantation might have looked a bit like this. This in Paramaribo is the splendid synagogue that Philip Dickland attends. I wasn't able to get inside because it wasn't one of the days when it was open. Inside, floor is of white sand. And one of the things they're quite proud of is that next door is the mosque. Suriname has a population of about 600,000 and it's incredibly diverse. And a significant Muslim community. So I'm just going to show you a few slides which I hope give a sense of what Paramaribo is like, its architecture. But along with this is the incredibly detailed documentation of these buildings and of who lived in them, carried out by Philip Dickland and his associates. Some of them are not in great condition, as you can see. The one on the right of that slide, there it is again, but next to one that is being maintained. So this rather odd mixture of buildings that are looked after, architecture that seems in some way on its way to being archaeology. But a very large number of these wooden buildings, some of them quite small. There's a very small house and a very small church. This is in quite a famous building, but not in great condition. Famous because it belonged to a free woman of colour who was one of the richest people in Suriname in the 1700s and owned extensive property. Some very large buildings. And again, there's some that are a bit better looked after. There has been a change of government in Suriname during 2020. This was the official residence of the First Lady, former president. To give you, I should tell you that President Bouterse had been convicted of murder. Nobody's quite sure what's going to happen in respect of that conviction, but he was voted out and he has stood down. His son had been convicted of drug smuggling, but it has at least been a peaceful transition. So I'm not sure what's happening to this building now. And that's the site run by Philip Dickland and his associates. So if you simply Google Suriname Heritage Guide, so it's not only about the buildings of Paramaribo, but about hundreds of plantations, each of which has been surveyed and documented. There are hundreds of maps which have been digitized, and there are data sheets on all of these plantations, detailing their archaeology, their architecture, what's known of those who owned them, and of the enslaved people who worked on them. An incredible bit of work that I'm not aware of being paralleled anywhere else, and really is a model for what I think any country could be doing. So please do have a look at that. Oh, I should say it's in Dutch, so good. But you can copy and paste into Google Translate, which is what I do, and a lot of it is there's a lot of images, a lot of maps, and a lot about Scottish plantation owners. So that's the second point: the documentation of the plantations and of these buildings. The third thing is John Steadman and his account of Suriname in the 1770s. And there's a Scottish connection here. This is John Steadman. Now, you can argue about whether he's a Scot or not. Both he and his father served in the Scots Brigade of the Dutch Army. Now, for 200 years, the Dutch Army had up to 6 regiments which were recruited in Scotland. And this provided a career opportunity in the military for Scots for all of that period. And it was a tradition in some families, particularly including in the north of Scotland, particularly in Sutherland, of people serving in the Dutch Brigade. John Steadman was one of these, and he volunteered while he was serving in the Dutch Brigade to join a different regiment, which was being sent to Suriname to put down what they regarded as a revolt of runaway slaves. And this is John Steadman with the leader who has been killed of one of the leaders of that uprising. He wrote a book about it, a narrative of a 5 years expedition against the revolted Negroes of Suriname, which was published in the 1790s. It was a frank account of a slave society, which is unsparing in the details of the violence that involved. And yet, what was published in the 1790s was heavily censored by the publishers. And it wasn't until 1988 that the full text was published. It's been described in various ways, including as apocalypse now in the 18th century. It is because Steadman wasn't an abolitionist. Steadman supported slavery, but he was frank in what he described. And because of that, it is disturbing and horrifying. And as I say, Steadman can be regarded as a Scottish writer, and that can be linked. What he tells us can be linked to the plantations that Dickland has recorded, including this fascinating. There are about 6 Scottish planters in Suriname when Steadman is there. And one of them is Walter Kennedy, whose father was a Presbyterian minister who served in Scotland and then in the Scots Kirk in Rotterdam. And I think 3 of his sons went to Suriname. And this is a bell which Philip Dickland has, which one of his contractors found on an abandoned plantation in Suriname. It is the name Hugo John on it and the Kennedy coat of arms. And this is Walter Kennedy's son. Walter Kennedy's brother, while he owned a plantation in Suriname, was professor of Greek at King's College, Aberdeen. So that's an extraordinarily unusual remnant of Scots involvement in a plantation, which we only have because of the work of Philip Dickland. Another remarkable thing about Suriname, if you remember, the title of Steadman's book was about the revolted Negroes, the runaway slaves who had joined together in an uprising. Now, these are called the Maroons, from the French word marron. And Maroons are runaways who have reclaimed their freedom and are living in a state of freedom. And remarkably, 1/5 of the population of Suriname are Maroons in 6 different nations who are semi-independent of the state. And the largest of these nations is the Samaka. I was lucky enough to be able to spend 5 days at an eco resort run by the Samaka people on an island high up the Suriname River. You can only really get to it by an hour's flight and then a half-hour canoe journey. One of the nice things about it was at the end of the school run, and these are the kids waiting in the morning for the school canoe, which had one stop a little bit further up the river, and then took them to school and back about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There are 6 villages around here. One of them runs this resort. One of the villages is called a Catholic village and the other are called African villages. And this is the entrance to one of the African villages. This is the gateway. It's difficult to get much detail about the spiritual practices within these villages, and you can't photograph within the villages, or what you can photograph is very limited. You certainly can't photograph the altars or shrines, but you can photograph the entrance. And this is to protect, I think, to protect the village from evil spirits. On the left is a woman who runs the village shop in one of the villages. And on the right is a woman who's a farmer. And she's one of the few farmers who are happy for outsiders to visit the farms. And the farming is on a cut and burn system on a 21 year cycle with 7 plots of land, which they cut, burn, cultivate for 3 years, and then move on to the next plot on that cycle. And the crops on these bits of ground are all mixed up with each other. These are some houses. They're not actually part of a village. These are houses that have been built by some of the people who work at the eco resort, so that they have somewhere across the river where they can live, but they're not technically a village. But it is the architecture that you find in the villages. And that's just a sense of that. This is Freddie, who's Samaka, who's the lifeguard at the eco resort. Now, what he's showing me there are marks on rocks in the river, which they believe are made by Amerindians from the sharpening of stone axes. I have no idea how old these are. And on the right-hand side is, just outside that village shop that I showed you earlier, are 2 bottles of beer buried in the ground as protection from evil spirits. And these are some of the women in the Catholic village putting on a display of traditional singing and dancing. So that's another reason why Suriname's interesting. But Suriname, there were some very early Scottish slave owners. Scots go on being slave owners in Suriname until 1863. And when slaves are emancipated and the Dutch government paid compensation, 1/8 of the compensation went to British slave owners, just over 12%. That's 9% to Scottish owners and 3% to English owners. So Scots go on illegally, in terms of British law, owning slaves in Suriname up till 1863. And one of the things which Michael and I did was to, using Philip Dickland's material, was to, I suppose, rediscover, find some of the remnants of that. And this is the tomb of James Balfour, who was from Fife, a Scots planter in Suriname, who died in 1843. There are 2 families, Balfours and Kirks, who are intermarried, interrelated. Balfour was described not long before his death as a strange man who was immensely wealthy but always wanted more. And it was said that he was buried in this tomb, which was constructed between the houses where the enslaved people lived and the plantation fields, so that they would still have to walk past him on their way to work in the mornings. um, there was apparently a mummified body inside the tomb until about the 1960s, 1970s, and it was opened every year to be cleaned, and you could see it. There's now just some very large bats. The Balfour, the Kirk family, the Balfours married into them, on both families owned plantations, built Greenmount House in Burnt Island in Fife. That's what it used to look like. It was burnt, and the ruin was there until about 15 years ago, and it's now gone. You can still see the stables and the walls that were around the grounds. And there is an interesting remnant of that, is that they brought back an enslaved woman from Suriname as a nursemaid for the children, and she stayed with the family until her death in, I think, 1917. So she's probably the last person in Scotland to be born enslaved to a Scottish owner and to live in Scotland. And there's a local group who are planning to commemorate her life. The Kirk family also donated ornithological specimens which belong to the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. This is their plantation, Waterloo, in Suriname. This is the plantation which was operating until the 1960s, 1970s. And the next photograph is taken from the same spot on the road, but now looking in the opposite direction. And you can see how it's disappearing into the bush. That's it in the later 1800s. That's the plantation house in, I think probably about the 1950s. And that's Michael on the left, standing at the top of the steps leading up to the front door and sitting by what we think is a swimming pool of the house. So you can see how it's been taken over. And that's another picture of the plantation with the canal, and the canal's now filled in and gone. So Suriname kind of bookends Scottish slave ownership, some of the earliest and some of the latest. And I think it's important for that reason. And it's also got an interesting connection with Scottish industrial history and industrial archaeology. In Glasgow, the Glasgow archives have records of some of the engineering companies. This is from one of the engineering companies, and you can see they're supplying plantation Waterloo and Hazard, which belongs to Kirk, and later Sankar in Suriname. And this is what they're supplying. It's a centrifuge, which is something to do with the sugar production process. It's really interesting that the top of that diagram is the date 1862. So at the time they're supplying this, they are supplying it to Scots who illegally owned slaves in Suriname. And that isn't a problem at the time. The legislation is simply ignored. And here's the kind of equipment that's there. That's Hazard Plantation. It's not my photograph, but this is Waterloo Sugar Works, machinery made in Glasgow. Or the big chimney of the boiling house. That's 1905, Maconey, Harvey and Co. The rollers from the sugar mill. And the only building that's left there is the mosque. And you can see how in front of the mosque, they've repurposed a little bit of the factory machinery as a bit of decoration in front. And sitting there in the middle of the bush in Suriname is a brick from Motherwell. I'm not sure what it was used to build. So 6 reasons why there is archaeology and architecture which helps us to understand that close relationship between Suriname and Scotland. So just back to these maps for a moment. So I've shown you Paramaribo in Suriname, marked there by the red dot as the capital. 90% of the population of 600,000 live in Paramaribo. The Samaka, just below Paramaribo, you can see a big area of water which was created for a very large hydroelectric scheme in the 1950s. flooded and quite a number of the Samaka villages, and those that remain are below that, and that's where Awadam, the eco-resort, is. And it's right over on the left-hand side of Suriname, in an area that's not named, but it's called Nikeri, where Waterloo Plantation is. So we had, the reason we were able to visit these places is because we'd hired a car in Paramaribo, and we drove from Paramaribo to Georgetown, the capital of Guyana. And that means crossing the Corentine River, which is the boundary between Suriname and Guyana. Although these are adjoining countries, the only legal way to cross, other than flying, is on a 15-car ferry that runs once a day, and that had, in 2019, had been out of service for about 4 months. So fortunately, it was back in service, and we were able to make the crossing. It was closed again during the rioting which followed in elections in Guyana. So we went from there. I said that Guyana had been 3 colonies. The one you will certainly have heard of is Demerara, and that's the bit around Georgetown. To the right of that is the bit that is particularly Scottish in its history, and particularly Highland, which is called Berbice. And New Amsterdam, which I'll show you a little bit later, is the capital of Berbice. And you know you're in somewhere that, in Berbice, you know in somewhere that has a strong Scottish influence because of the place names. And I'm just going to run through a few of these. And the Mandir is the Hindu temple, Navar temple. That's all within an hour's drive on the Berbice coast. I'm just going to loop back to Suriname for a moment. The bit of Suriname that is near to Berbice. There's a Belladrom in Berbice. There's also a Belladrom in Suriname. And there's Moy. And there's another Inverness. And there are others. There is nowhere else on the planet where you've got that concentration in such a small area of the place names from East Inverness, East of Ross, and into Sutherland. And this is New Amsterdam. And there we've got the spire of the Scots Presbyterian Church, All Saints, and again the mosque next to it. And this is the church. And last year it was celebrating its 200th anniversary. That's the 200th anniversary of the congregation and the 200th anniversary of the building. It was founded, 200 years, and we had a wonderfully warm welcome there. And our visit in their 200th anniversary year of the Scots Presbyterian Church has been their only contact with Scotland. And they opened it up for us. We were able to go up the tower. And at the top of it are bells, which were donated to the church in the 1820s. They were donated by the largest plantation owner, largest holder of slaves in Berbice, called Wolfert Katz, from a Jewish plantation owner from Bohemia. He ordered these bells for his plantation house. When he got them, and the clock that they go along with, when he got them, they were too big, so he donated them to the church. His daughter married a Dr. William Monroe, and they lived in Inverness. And that's us up. The clock, unfortunately, isn't there. The bells are, and the clock is still there. Round about New Amsterdam, there are buildings similar to the ones in Paramaribo. New Amsterdam's 17,000 people. This is one of the other churches, so buildings there being well looked after. That's a view of it from the other side. The church I've just shown you was originally the colony church, and they alternated. It was Presbyterian one Sunday and Episcopalian the next. And then the Episcopalians, the Anglicans, wanted to build their own church. And so this is also All Saints, but All Saints Anglican Church. Now, if Suriname is a country of rivers, Guyana, or at least the cultivated part of it along the coast, is a country of dikes and canals. It's reclaimed from coast like this, and it's reclaimed by building big sea walls and with sluices, which they call cokers. There's in some places there's been coastal erosion, so you can see a coker out to sea there. That would originally have been the coastline, and that's just outside Georgetown. There are big canals, there's around Rose Hall, and there are little canals, and these bridges over these little canals are the only access to the main access to the houses you can see on the left-hand side. There was a commission in the 1940s which estimated the amount of work that had been done to create the coastal plantations. On my calculation, which I think is correct, the creation of the coastal plantations of Guyana by enslaved labour without machinery is the equivalent of digging 300 Caledonian canals. It's an immense work of engineering. There are also now holy places. These are Hindu flags that are often outside Hindu houses. They're there for a limited period of time, and afterwards they have to be placed in water. So a lot of them end up on the canal banks. There's also another important remnant of British involvement in Guyana with cricket. You see cricket being played by kids everywhere. Here's another remnant. On the left-hand side is all that remains of another sugar works on the plantation Chateau Margao, just now part of Georgetown. And this is Patricia and her son, who are Indo-Guyanese, descendants of indentured labourers who were brought to Guyana and Trinidad. Well, Guyana was the first place to which indentured labourers were brought from the Indian subcontinent. And Indo-Guyanese are now the largest group of the population. Chateau Margao was owned by Lachlan Cumming from near Elgin, and he moved back. That's the house he bought, Black Hills, which has now been burnt, and I'm not sure what state it's in. But interestingly, he was also part of the committee which established the Scots Presbyterian Church in Georgetown. And he brought back a man who had been a man called Welcome, who was one of his enslaved household in Demerara, and he became a house servant at Black Hills and fell out with Lachlan Cumming and left. I don't know what became of him. This is not a picture of him, but it's a picture of an enslaved African from the same period. So I think this is how Lachlan Cumming wanted his servant Welcome to look. One of the places we wanted to visit was Plantation Belladrom in Berbice, because Michael and myself, we know a lot about its creation by the Frasers of Belladrom. And I would say, I suppose the archaeology of the coast of Guyana, particularly we're interested in Berbice, is a sort of landscape archaeology. I think it is about trying to understand how these huge plantations have been created, the drainage systems. there's and we just don't know, unlike Suriname, where Philip Dickland has done that enormous work, we just don't know what's left there of later industrial archaeology of machinery. So I'm sure there's a huge amount to be investigated. There's really only one road in both Suriname, one tarred road in Suriname and along the coast and Guyana. Off that, it's what they call sand roads. So we all would drive off the road down a sand road a bit, as far as we could. And then we stopped. And this is he would call himself a farmer called Keith on El Dorado, which is the neighbouring plantation to Belladrom. And he showed us how to get down to the coast and the sea wall. And I think that's Keith's house. But again, you can see the contrast there between a fairly new house, well looked after, and Keith, who grows vegetables and sells them. And one of the highlights of the visit is that after being talking to him for a bit, Keith launched into a praise of farming. This was between 5 and 10 minutes, and it was his thoughts structured round the psalm, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." And it was his thoughts on his role and the importance of farming. And it was a privilege to hear it. So I just pulled these together because, as to give some indication. It's only a fraction of the diversity of these countries. Keith, who's African Guyanese, Patricia, who's Indo-Guyanese, the Samaka woman from Suriname. And I'm going to finish with this slide because I've talked about the architecture and the archaeology, but part of the legacy of British-Dutch involvement in these colonies is not only slavery, it's what came after that, it's the bringing of indentured labourers from the Indian subcontinent, and then right through to independence and afterwards, it's interference and intervention. The British government, Britain stepped in 1953 and removed the duly elected government of Guyana, sent in troops. They were actually, I think they were Welsh, the Welsh Fusiliers, because they thought the government might be sympathetic, might be left-leaning and be sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And as part of that, Britain encouraged racialized politics. There was horrible intercommunal violence in the 60s and the 70s. Many people left. And in September of last year, following a disputed election, these two brothers, Isaiah Henry and Joel Henry, went to gather coconuts at the back dam of one of the plantations on the west coast of Berbice. And their mutilated bodies were found. They'd been hacked to death with cutlasses, the machetes, which are commonly used in agriculture. And then the next day or day after, somebody had been at school with them, Naresh Singh, who's Indo-Guyanese, was pulled from his motorbike and his mutilated body was found there. There have been arrests since then, and the father of three brothers has been outstanding in his public statements about the need not to take revenge, to rise above this. But I finish with this because this is history, this is archaeology, this is industrial archaeology, it's a very old architecture, but it's a history which is unfortunately still there in the lives and the deaths of the people of Guyana and of Suriname. And that brings me to the end of my talk.